Hey guys, Tom here. So just before we get into today's video, just a quick heads up that for some reason I lost the audio from this little microphone in the second half of the video you're about to watch. So the audio isn't up to the usual standard, and I apologize for that, but please persist through. There is still some good info in the second half of the video. So just a quick heads up, I do hope you enjoy it, and let's get straight into the video now. Hey, it's Tom here and welcome back to the channel. So another quarter has rolled around, and that means that we have a brand new quarter of 13F filings. Now, if you're not familiar already, a 13F filing is basically a filing that large investors in the US have to make every quarter. If you manage more than 100 million US dollars, you have to disclose all of the stocks that you own, and that allows us to then compare those holdings for some of our favorite investors against what they owned the quarter before that and the quarter before that, and we can see what they have been buying and selling over the past 3 months. Now, as usual, there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. So any 13F filings will not pick up any cash positions. They won't pick up any shorts if the investors that you follow do any shorting, and they also won't pick up any international holdings. Now, I do actually have a second website that I sometimes use to get some of these regulatory filings called Ticker. I don't have any affiliation or sponsorship with Ticker or anything like that, but what Ticker does is it doesn't only pick up the US 13F filings, it actually picks up all regulatory filings globally. So if an investor, for example, buys up a 5% ownership stake in a company in Japan, that will trigger a 5% Japanese ownership filing in that particular country, and those types of filings will also show up in Ticker. So in this video, I'm going to go through some of my favorite investors, sort of the usual culprits if you have watched one of these update videos before, and like usual, I also like to add in a newer investors 13F that I've kind of just started following recently. So for that particular video, you may be surprised to hear that that is actually Nick Sleep. Now, Nick Sleep ran a fund called Nomad for about a decade or so, closed up the fund in I think it was about 2014, and returned about 20% per year to investors. So an incredible track record, and I kind of just recently stumbled across the fact that Nick Sleep also has quite a large investment portfolio for his charity, which more or less mirrors the holdings that they had back in 2014 when they closed down Nomad. So that was an interesting discovery, and one that will be pretty cool to follow along with as well. So that is also one that I will cover in this video. So if you enjoy the video, please hit like and hit subscribe, but for now, let's get straight into it. Okay, so let's kick things off with the big dog, which is Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, and have a look through their 13F so we can see what they have been up to in terms of their stock positions over the last quarter. Now, Berkshire Hathaway, as of the latest filing, has 47 stock positions. Quite a large number of stocks in the portfolio, but an important thing to keep in mind with Berkshire is that a lot of the weight of the portfolio is kind of up the top end. So generally speaking, I'm typically focusing just on the large holdings in Berkshire Hathaway. I have been trying to pay more attention to the smaller stuff recently because that's generally what Ted and Todd are kind of doing at Berkshire. So it's not just Warren Buffett, it's also Todd Combs and Ted Weschler manage a smaller amount of money at Berkshire as well. So let's have a look through some of the changes. Now, if we go through the top 7 positions, we see absolutely no changes at all. So the top 7 positions remain Apple, which is a massive 40% of the portfolio at this point. We also have Bank of America, American Express, Coca-Cola, Kraft Heinz, Moody's, and Verizon, rounding out the top 7 positions for Berkshire, all of which were unchanged in the last quarter. Now, if we look right through to the top, say, 20 positions in Berkshire's portfolio, we actually do start to see some changes. So we saw a very, very small change in US Bancorp's shareholding, less than 1%. So he now owns 128,888,906 shares of US Bancorp. And that is a change of sort of minus about 800,000 shares. So 800,000 off about 130 million, call it, shares is a very, very small change, but a small sale of US Bancorp. We also saw about a 10% reduction in the holding in General Motors. So that's one that Buffett has sort of slowly added to over the past few years. So interesting to see him sort of turning around on that. He sold 7 million shares, which is about a 10% reduction. And a couple of other sales in sort of these top 20 positions. So we saw Chevron continued to be sold down. Again, a pretty small sale in the grand scheme of things, only about 2%. And we also saw AbbVie, which, like General Motors, has also been reduced by 10%. And on the selling side through the entire portfolio, there really wasn't that much else to write home about. We had 3 stocks that were sold altogether, which were Liberty Global Class A, we also had Biogen Inc., and we also had Axalta Coating Systems Limited. So all 3 of those stocks were 100% sold out of. But all of them represented less than 0.2% of the portfolio. So these are all very, very small positions relative to Berkshire's overall portfolio. So as far as sales for Buffett and also Ted and Todd, really not much news out of this one, but we do have a few things that are kind of interesting on the buying side. So we only have one brand new stock. Again, it's a tiny percentage of the portfolio, and this is Organon and Co. That is a company I've never heard of and know nothing about, but if you do know something about it, definitely drop that down in the comments below. They have a $46 million position in that stock now, but again, Berkshire's so big that only represents 0.02% of the portfolio, and that was the only brand new stock for Berkshire from this quarter. Now, some of the other buys are a little more interesting to me. So we saw an increase of 2% in the shareholding of RH. I'm pretty confident RH is a Ted and Todd stock. It's just too small in the portfolio, I think, to be Buffett. But it's worked extremely well. I'll put up a stock chart for RH here. I believe Berkshire started getting into that one around the second quarter of 2020 towards some of the lows for RH. So that one's worked very well. We also saw a slight add to Aon PLC, which again is a small position that I'm not particularly familiar with. And arguably the biggest news in terms of the buys for Berkshire Hathaway was actually Kroger. So Berkshire added to their Kroger stake by about 20%, added close to 11 million shares, and it now represents about 0.8% of the portfolio. So again, still very small in the grand scheme, but that's probably the most notable buy to show up for Berkshire in this filing. Now, if I jump across to ticker to try and see some of the international holdings for Berkshire and see if anything's changed there, keep in mind this won't pick up every international holding for Berkshire Hathaway. It's really just if it triggers some sort of regulatory filing. So if they buy up 5 or 10% of a stake, the rules will be different in each country, but if they have to file something, it will show up in ticker. So again, we continue to see some of the Japanese trading companies. So they came into the portfolio for Berkshire probably about a year ago now. Those are basically unchanged, but interestingly, we do have one relatively new stock. So this was added on the 20th of January 2021. So in the first quarter, it's a very, very small position, but it is in a small insurance company that actually trades on the Italian stock exchange. So on the BIT exchange, if you want to look this one up, again, I'll put a screenshot of the ticker. Ticker symbol is CASS. And again, very small position. It's about $73 million, which is actually close to 7% of the shares outstanding in that particular business. But like many of these other changes in the portfolio recently, it's really not a sizable one for the overall pie at Berkshire Hathaway. Okay, so next up, let's have a look at Charlie Munger over at the Daily Journal Corporation. This is going to be a fairly quick update because literally nothing has changed, and this is pretty classic. Charlie Munger, obviously we saw him add Alibaba to his portfolio earlier in 2021, and I think that was the first move that Charlie Munger has made for close to a decade, possibly more than a decade. So it's pretty unusual to see any changes from Charlie Munger and the Daily Journal Corporation, and we kind of saw that again. So Charlie was just kind of sitting back and letting these stocks compound as he likes to do, but this is what the portfolio looked like at the time, at least in the US. So 44% of the portfolio is Bank of America, 33% is Wells Fargo, 17.5% is Alibaba, 3% in US Bancorp, and you have a small 0.3% holding in POSCO. So no other changes to the portfolio. If I look in ticker, we see the exact same thing, so no other holdings creeping in here. I do know that the Daily Journal Corporation does have a very substantial holding relative to its portfolio size in BYD, which is a Chinese electric vehicle manufacturer, but they're not a large enough holder of that stock to trigger a filing that would show up on one of these websites that I'm looking at. So that's something to keep in mind. The percentages I just mentioned for those US stocks are probably lower in reality if you include that BYD stake, but that just doesn't show up on any of the websites here. Okay, so next on the list we have the shameless cloner himself, Mohnish Pabrai. Now, in terms of updates for Mohnish Pabrai, there's a little bit of news, but not too much to write home about. If we look at his 13F filing, we see 3 holdings, as we did last quarter. Those holdings are Micron or MU, SRG, Seritage Growth Properties, and Alibaba. So Mohnish Pabrai did follow Charlie Munger into Alibaba. And he actually added quite significantly to his stake. So he added 53%, and it now represents about 20% of his US portfolio, 21% of his US portfolio. But as you'll see very shortly, Mohnish Pabrai does actually have quite a few international holdings to kind of consider in the overall mix as well. So interesting to see that from Mohnish Pabrai. This was kind of expected. He actually has mentioned in some recent talks that he was continuing to buy Alibaba, which would have fallen into the quarter for which we're seeing this filing. So not a huge surprise to me, but interesting to see that he continues to hold Micron and Sharesight. Okay, now if I jump over to ticker, we do actually see quite a number of international holdings which have triggered some sort of regulatory filing for Mohnish Pabrai. So I'll kind of start from the top. So we have Nice Holdings Co., which I believe is a financial services business in South Korea from memory. That one's been in the portfolio for Pabrai for I think at least a year now, but that continues to stay in the portfolio. We also see Shinnikin Group Co. Limited, which is a Japanese real estate business. That is one that I think actually only got added in 2021. So again, that continues to be in the portfolio. One stock you may have heard Mohnish Pabrai talk about recently is Sharesight Logistics. This is a Turkish warehousing and logistics company that Pabrai has been talking about all over the place, I think, in some of his recent talks, if you've seen those. So not too surprising to continue to see that in his portfolio. So a bit of a mix of kind of countries and businesses here. So we've got a South Korean financial services company, we've got a Japanese real estate company, and now we've got a Turkish logistics business as well. So interesting to see those showing up. And there are a few more names in the portfolio as well, and these last three are actually all out of India. So we see Rain Industries. This is again one that Mohnish Pabrai has been talking about in some of his presentations over the last few years. Really, he's held Rain Industries for some time. It represents about 5% or 6% of the portfolio for Pabrai. And finally, we have Edelweiss Financial Services Limited and Suntec Realty, which again are both Indian businesses. Now, the only ones where we actually see any changes here, we see the Alibaba stake that got bumped up quite a bit. We saw Edelweiss Financial actually get sold down a little bit, so that was shrunk in terms of his shareholding by about 18%. And we actually saw a slight increase in shareholding at Suntec Realty of about 3%. So really interesting to see some of these international holdings for Pabrai. If you look just purely at his US portfolio, Alibaba makes up about a little over 20%, but if you include it in the overall pie here, it's about 11.9%. So Pabrai usually limits himself to about 10% on his biggest holdings in the fund, and that is right where he's at now with Alibaba. Okay, next on the list we have Guy Spier, a good friend of Mohnish Pabrai's, and Guy Spier is one who is very, very good at kind of just sitting back and letting businesses do their thing. In the last quarter we saw literally zero change in any of the positions for Guy Spier. This quarter we actually do have a couple of updates, including 2 new positions, which I think you'll probably find quite interesting. So let's just start from the top in terms of the biggest, kind of down to the smallest holdings for Guy Spier. We have Berkshire B shares, which are about 18% of the portfolio. He does actually also have some Berkshire A shares, so if you combine those two together, Berkshire is about 25% of the portfolio roughly, but that's where kind of Berkshire Hathaway sits. Next up we got American Express, Bank of America, MasterCard, Micron, Ferrari, and of course the second Berkshire stake as well. So no changes in those positions, but then we see the first brand new position for Guy Spier. And this is also in Alibaba. So you may be starting to see a bit of a theme here with some investors kind of starting off with Charlie Munger buying into Alibaba, and then we're seeing Mohnish Pabrai and now Guy Spier get into Alibaba as well. So brand new position for Guy Spier. He owns 47,500 shares of Baba in the US, sort of listed version of Alibaba. It's about a $10 or $11 million position and about 5% of the US portfolio. Now we have some of the other positions that remain unchanged for Guy Spier. Moody's, Sharesight Growth Properties, Twitter and Google all remain unchanged. But we do have one more brand new stock, which is actually the Daily Journal Corporation. This was a really interesting move to see from Guy Spier. Of course, we just talked about the Daily Journal Corporation's 13F filing a few minutes ago in this video. So interesting to see Guy Spier actually purchase into that stock. So Daily Journal, I have done a video on, I think in about December of last year, kind of analysing that company. The way you can sort of look at Daily Journal Corporation is that it has the stock portfolio, which is quite sizable relative to its market cap. You also have sort of this dying newspaper business, and you also have sort of a growing software as a service business, which is a little bit unknown in terms of the future growth and cash flows that will come from that segment of the business. But at the right price, I think the Daily Journal Corporation is really interesting. So I was a little bit surprised to see Guy Spier buy into that, but that was the second new holding in the portfolio. And finally, we only saw one sale from Guy Spier, and that was of Wells Fargo. Previously, it was 3.1% of the pie, and he has sold completely out of that, sold 100% of the shares in Wells. Now, jumping over very quickly to ticker, we actually see two other stocks for Guy Spier. First, we have Indian Energy Exchange Limited, and we also have iTech AB. I believe those are both Indian businesses. Indian Energy Exchange obviously is, but I think iTech AB is as well. Those represent 1.5% and 3% of the portfolio respectively, and again, no change at all in the shareholding of those two. Okay, so two more 13Fs that I want to have a look at. Next on the list we have Li Lu at Himalaya Capital. Now, this is probably the 13F that I was most looking forward to this quarter. Like I said, we've seen Charlie Munger go into Alibaba, we've seen Mohnish Pabrai and now Guy Spier also go into Alibaba. Li Lu has been investing money for Charlie Munger for some time, and a big percentage of it is in China and in Chinese stocks. So I was really excited to potentially also maybe see something like Alibaba or Tencent or one of these other Chinese businesses show up in Li Lu's portfolio. And it's worth keeping in mind that Li Lu probably has the option to also buy some of those stocks on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, which then wouldn't show up in a 13F filing unless he bought a big percentage of the overall company, so that's something to keep in mind. But I was actually kind of surprised to see that there has been absolutely zero change to anything in Li Lu's 13F filing. So these are his current positions, and all of them are unchanged from the previous update. So we have Micron as the biggest position in terms of the US holdings. At least it's 47% of the portfolio. That's been a home run for Li Lu, and it's worked out very, very well. We also have Bank of America, Google, Facebook, Apple, and Pinduoduo. So the big ranges in position sizing there. Micron, like I said, is 47% of the pie. Those position sizes shrink down quite aggressively to the point where Pinduoduo is only about 2% of the overall US portfolio. And jumping over to ticker now, this actually does pick up one additional holding which the 13F filings don't, and that is BYD. Now, I've already mentioned BYD in this video, and that's again because of the Charlie Munger link. And the Daily Journal owning some BYD, as Charlie Munger has told us in the past. BYD is a very, very large position for Li Lu and Himalaya Capital. So I just talked about the massive Micron position. That's about $970 million roughly. The BYD stake for Li Lu is close to $2 billion. So it's more than double the Micron stake. So very, very large position. And interestingly, Li Lu and Himalaya Capital actually sold down some of their BYD stakes. So BYD has been rocketing up the last couple of years, and he's chosen to sell about 14% of that particular holding. Okay, now the last 13F that I want to take a look at is none other than Nick Sleep. Now, Nick Sleep has been getting a bit more popular this year after Mohnish Pabrai, frankly, talking about him quite a lot, and also William Green writing about him in this book, Richer, Wiser, Happier, which is fantastic if you haven't read it. And Nick Sleep had an interesting journey in terms of his investing kind of partnership. So he started in the early 2000s, being a pretty traditional kind of deep value style investor. So buying like beaten up Zimbabwean cement companies at 10 or 20% of replacement cost and that sort of stuff. And he eventually went through a transition, like a lot of value investors do, to buying higher quality compounder type businesses. And by the time he wrapped up his fund in about 2014, he really had almost all of his eggs in about three baskets, being Amazon, Costco, and also Berkshire Hathaway. So that was back in 2014. In the book Richer, Wiser, Happier, it does actually mention that he continued to hold basically those stocks personally for a long time, to the point where Amazon was doing so well, it was like 70 or 80% of his net worth, and he sold, I think, half of the stake in about 2018 or 19. I might be 1 year either side of the actual dates there, but it's in that sort of range. So really interesting to kind of stumble across a tweet actually on Twitter saying that we can see some of Nick Sleep's holdings through one of his charities. His charity files with 13F and has some stocks in it. So managed to dig that out. And I guess not that surprising, but if we look at the 13F now, we actually still see only 3 stocks, and they are in fact those 3 stocks. So they are Amazon, Costco, and Berkshire Hathaway. And in the last quarter, we saw almost no change. So Amazon was sold down 3%, Costco was sold down 2%, and Berkshire was unchanged. Now, it's a little bit tricky, of course, to see why buyers or sellers might be happening. Since this is obviously Nick Sleep's charity, I imagine they're probably liquidating some of those shares for charitable endeavours and those sorts of things. So I probably wouldn't take too many investment sort of hints from the small moves that are happening in this portfolio. But really interesting to see, even 7 years now after closing the fund, that the same 3 stocks remain in Nick Sleep's portfolio. And I did actually hear that after selling some of that Amazon stake a couple of years ago, Nick Sleep did actually invest in a UK business called ASOS. Now, that doesn't actually show up obviously in the 13F because 13Fs are US companies only, but it doesn't actually show up in ticker either, so perhaps that stake is not large enough to warrant any sort of regulatory filing, but I would be surprised if he didn't also have that as sort of a 4th holding that we can't quite see here. So if I jump across to ticker, there's really nothing extra to see. It's still just those 3 holdings, Amazon, Costco, and Berkshire Hathaway. So those are some updates on the holdings of my favourite investors, the usual culprits plus a new 13F from Nick Sleep, which I hope you enjoyed that update. If you did, please hit like and hit subscribe. If you've got any interesting 13F takeaways that I didn't cover in this video, I'd definitely love to hear them down in the comments below, so be sure to let me know what those are. But like I say, that's it for this video, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.